So to reiterate, Kolar published Foreign Faction in 2012. Remember, that was a year before the grand jury indictments finally became public. I've often wondered whether the challenges in that book to the mainstream narrative were what prompted Charlie Brennan to look at the case more critically and make that famous open records request.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Number 3. An incomplete summary of Kolar's January 2006 presentation to Mary Lacey. If you want to read absolutely everything he writes about it, go and have a look at Foreign Faction, page 271.
To this murder. So I was asked to present information that I had uncovered and discovered during my part of the investigation. And during a cold case task force meeting that had about 30 people involved, I gave a 2-hour presentation.
Now, I'm not sure if he means there were 30 people involved in his cold case review team. We know there's been another one of those more recently under a new DA and different team. But think about how how his team must have felt at the end of that presentation, exactly the same way Steve Thomas felt, which is just that it falls on deaf ears. That you have these investigators working and the DA's office want to hear a particular outcome when they don't hear it, what they do. Can you imagine working on something for that length of time and then it's almost like an editor receiving a book that you've written for 2 years, simply saying, we're not going to publish this. Pretty soul-destroying, pretty demoralizing. Especially if what you feel you've done is true and authentic and sincere, and you have someone at the top basically saying, I disagree with this. And is that person at the top correct, reasonable in their assessment? So to reiterate, Kolar published Foreign Faction in 2012. Remember, that was a year before the grand jury indictments finally became public. I've often wondered whether the challenges in that book to the mainstream narrative were what prompted Charlie Brennan to look at the case more critically and make that famous open records request. And we're going to deal with that issue at a certain point, so take note of that. Okay, so number 1, Kolar rejected Lou Smith's point of entry. Now, this is from his book dealing with the chapter dealing with the January 2006 presentation. He writes, close examination of the crime scene video completed by Boulder crime scene investigators on the evening of December 26, 1996 virtually eliminated the possibility that entry had been made to the Ramsey residence through the train room window well. This video provided more detailed information about the condition of the window well than what had been depicted in the 35mm still photographs. Now, that's quite a generic, and I mean this entire chapter is very generic about the contents of his presentation. He probably was quite wary and afraid that he might be sued for sharing sensitive information. But we know what that sensitive information was, that there was a spider web on the side of that train room window, and that it would be impossible to get through the train room window in and out and leave that spider web in place, right? Number 2, Kolar rejected Smith's stun gun theory. Now, we've already dealt with that. He writes, I then moved forward to examine the theory that a stun gun had been used to silence JonBenet. Now, I find that statement just crazy in and of itself. A stun gun used to silence, when a stun gun used in the middle of the night is really, really loud. This is a house with 4 people sleeping in it. And not only that, not only the sound of the stun gun, but the sound a child makes, or any person makes, when you use a device like that, they make a noise. It's quite hard not to. Notwithstanding the fact that Boulder County Coroner John Mayer reported the undetermined marks on JonBenet to be abrasions versus burn marks, DA investigators conducted their own comparison of the most likely brand of stun gun alleged to have been used in the assault. What's really important to mention there is DA investigators, not Boulder PD investigators, district attorney investigators. And so they went through all the stun guns they could find. And what did they find? It's literally, Loosmith has a theory. Here they are testing the theory out, and they find they can't prove it. 1-to-1 photographs comparing the stun gun probes to the injuries on JonBenet had not yet been prepared. However, I asked that this be done. So that's something that where he took the investigation forward, where he basically, an area that they simply assumed to be true, he, to his credit, tried to prove to be true. Now think about Lacey talking about conjecture and flights of fantasy. It's flights of fantasy to say it's a stun gun just based on seeing marks. And there's no evidence of a stun gun. It's really irony that she uses these words given just how well Kolar investigated, for example, this area. He says, a series of PowerPoint photographs were completed that revealed the measurements of the electronic probes did not match the injuries of the body, on the body of JonBenet. Now, what's left out here is he then talks about the railway tracks, which do match the injuries on her body. It was related to me that the high-tech boot print, so Kolar is a little coy on the high-tech boot print, especially since we know that print was ultimately linked to. I mean, he's coy here. I don't think he was that coy in the presentation. He's also coy on how that evidence came to light. During the grand jury testimony, as far as I know, Burke and another witness apparently admitted that he had high-tech shoes. We also see Kolar debunking the DNA myth, something that likely stung Lacey to kingdom come, as she felt that DNA would be the breakthrough, and that the DNA side would be a shining legacy regarding this case. Well, has it been? Is it? Number 3, Kolar rejects the idea of Patsy as the killer. To Kolar's credit, and this is where he builds on Steve Thomas's sterling detective work, Kolar takes the evidence against Patsy, but decides the author of the ransom note is not necessarily the killer. He says, I didn't quite buy the hypothesis that Patsy had lost her temper and struck JonBenet. She had not been eliminated as the author of the ransom note, which certainly left open the possibility that she had involvement in the crime. I just couldn't reconcile the fact that Patsy was, by all accounts, a loving and doting mother, and I had difficulty envisioning her ever brutalizing either one of her children. And I must say, I tend to agree with that. And then he makes a foray into one of the most underestimated and misunderstood areas of the Ramsey case, the true family dynamics. This, I think, is an area that Kolar could definitely be credited with. If you think about Lacey's scathing letter, you'd imagine Kolar's presentation to be filled with unsubstantiated conspiracies, but quoting statistics in a criminal case, while not technically a matter of fact, is more science, even more crime rocket science than not. So in this regard, he writes, the FBI had also advised Boulder investigators of the discovery of JonBenet's body that they needed to take a close look at the family. That's from the FBI, right? Statistically, a child found murdered in the home usually involved a family member. And I'm sure during his presentation, he actually provided those statistics. You know, when he says that, he's actually saying by far the majority of cases, statistically, you're likely to see a family member involved in this sort of crime. FBI agents shared another word of advice. The circumstances surrounding this crime led them to believe that 2 hands were involved in this murder. Now, that is something that is a little bit vague. Does he mean that JonBenet's killers involved 2 people, or that the person who committed the crime also had an accessory covering it up? It's not very clear here. The second motive present, quite obvious due to the violence perpetrated against JonBenet, was identified as sadistic murder, sexual homicide. The injuries inflicted upon JonBenet left little doubt about this motive. All things considered, these were entirely different and contrasting motives that seemed to defy explanation. Now, I do think that the motives, or certainly some of those words used, sadism, I do agree with that. I do agree that there's a sadistic element. And I also think that the sexual homicide is a very accurate way of thinking about this case. Now, of course, as soon as you discover, as Kolar did, contrasting motives, you're on your way to figuring out what really happened here. The key is not to be stymied by these contrasts, but to reconcile them using the known facts, evidence, and where possible, family dynamics. While Kolar does well to take the baton, as it were, from Steve Thomas, in some areas I feel he still falls short, such as the idea that the ransom note was written in the kitchen. He writes, based upon a neighbor's observation, it appeared that he may have written the note beneath the dimmed lights of the kitchen. I think you should really be writing here he or she. I also think Kolar is on the right track when he talks about an organized versus a disorganized offender, as well as the reference to an unsophisticated mind, but I think it could do with some fine-tuning. Now, when he talks about writing the ransom note in the kitchen, you should really think about all those windows, writing the notes with all those windows, especially with the dimmed lights on. At night, someone doing that's going to be very visible. I don't think the ransom note was written in the kitchen. I think it was written in the basement. Number 4, the loose wrist bindings. I do think a subtle area of the Ramsey case that nevertheless has major psychological implications are the loose wrist bindings. Kudos to Kolar for picking up on these. It's also hard to fathom how Lacey could fault Kolar here for not being factual in his analysis as well as logical in his inferences. He writes, Dr. Mayer, the coroner conducting the autopsy, noted that the binding remaining on one of JonBenet's wrists was loose enough for him to slip a finger beneath a cord. It seemed apparent that these bindings were not intended to restrain JonBenet, but may have been applied for another purpose. Also, number 5, duct tape was placed on JonBenet's mouth after death. Unless I'm forgetting something, this is arguably Kolar's greatest insight into this case. While it makes sense that the duct tape was a form of pageantry to make the crime look worse than it really was, or at least different than it really was, just as the ransom note did, in effect to impute an adult perpetrator, what is also interesting is Kolar's observation, which makes sense, for why the duct tape appears to have been applied post-mortem. And so Kolar wrote that a perfect imprint of JonBenet's lips was left on the sticky side of the duct tape, something that was unlikely if JonBenet was still alive, and perhaps trying to talk and or move her mouth if it was applied while she was alive. And so he writes in his book, regarding the presentation, the duct tape suggests that the tape had been placed on her face after her death. Conceivably, this was another potential aspect of staging. Well, I think it was. Although Kolar touches on dynamics in his chapter about his presentation, he ends up glossing over it and certainly doesn't mention the narrower aspect, which I feel is perhaps more pertinent, child psychology. What he does mention is the unhappy ending of his presentation when he basically said he felt that Burke's medical records needed to be disclosed. These had been withheld, but more specifically he said we should be seeking the psychiatric records of Burke. Although, as I say, Kolar's efforts were an improvement on Steve Thomas's, in a sense he took Steve Thomas's vague scenario of someone losing their temper and striking JonBenet and sticky taped it onto Burke. Personally, I found this not only a clumsy fathoming of the evidence, but inauthentic as well. Where, pray tell, did the sexual element occur in the crime if she was struck with a flashlight in the kitchen? And please don't tell me Patchy staged that as well. In my opinion, the mechanics of the incident played out very differently, and not in the kitchen, and not out of anger, but rather fear of discovery, likely prompted by JonBenet screaming out in pain. Nevertheless, to Kolar's credit, he made his presentation 6 years before publishing Foreign Faction, and 7 years before, at least in a certain sense, he was vindicated by at least some of the opinions fleshed out in the grand jury true bills. Now, I think what's also worth mentioning is I don't think it's really a case that he was vindicated by the grand jury true bills. I think he was aware of the grand jury true bills and used these to some extent to inform his presentation and to inform his investigation. Kolar published Foreign Faction in 2012. Remember, that was a year before the grand jury indictments finally became public. And I think that date, Foreign Faction coming out in 2012, the grand jury indictments coming out in 2013, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's kind of the reason why Mary Lacy is trying to shut him down, because by not shutting him down, it was opening this can of worms to information that the DA knew they were suppressing, knew would embarrass them as well, and it did. Some, like Ramsey lawyer Lynn Wood, have dismissed the indictments as a mere footnote in the Ramsey story. Well, he wouldn't he? Would do that. See what I did there. While others, like Fleet White, consider the indictments hugely significant. I mean, if the grand jury decisions were so unimportant, why were they hidden? Why was the public and the media misled? Why the whole pageantry of the grand jury in the first place, when it seemed the intention all along was to avoid going to trial and having a repeat of the O.J. circus, this time in Boulder? I would say because it was a huge deal. What do you think? And I think because journalists have been so weak at remembering the history of this case, the whole history, and because attention spans are so short, and because opportunists abound, the Ramsey case is where it is today, and the mainstream version is what it is today. But is it the truth? Phew, well, that has been almost an hour, 51 minutes of analysis. Some of you have asked for longer videos or longer analysis. Is that the sort of length that you're able to stomach? I'd be interested to know in the comments. I'm going to be taking this further. We are going to be continuing with Kolar's investigation and specifically where he follows Dr. Mayer getting a second opinion in terms of that very sensitive area, the essay of JonBenet. Was there any evidence of there being prior essay to the day of the incident? So that's the one area we want to go into. I also want to go into another area, which is Kolar talking about, so basically publishes Foreign Faction, the grand jury indictments come out in 2013. 3 years later, they make the CBS docuseries, and Kolar actually wanted to write about those indictments in Foreign Faction, but he was afraid of being sued, and so he ultimately didn't. But then he did go on to write a postscript, which wasn't published as part of any updated version of Foreign Faction, but he nevertheless wrote it. And we're going to be dealing with that in a further analysis as well. So look out for the mini-series to follow on this one, Second Opinion, and then possibly another mini-series. It might actually even be longer than a mini-series, but a series dealing with the postscript to Foreign Faction. So quite a lot of interesting stuff in store for you guys, so look out for that. Thank you for listening this far, and I'll see you guys next time.